My name is Elias Montclair, and on the evening of my 70th birthday, I received the kind of message no father should ever see. It wasn't long, just 2 short sentences on a glowing screen. My son, Theo, as he likes to be called, had written, "We need space. Please don't reach out to us anymore." Cold. Clinical. Like a dismissal letter from a corporation. But the wound went deeper than his words. Beneath the message sat a small red heart, pressed by my daughter-in-law, Genevieve. She hadn't just agreed with him. She had applauded it. In that single tap of her finger, decades of generosity, sacrifice, and devotion were reduced to something disposable. I sat in the study of my riverside estate, the same home where I had raised my family, and felt the weight of silence pressing in. For years I had provided everything: cars, apartments, allowances, thinking I was building a legacy. What I had truly built was entitlement. That night, I made a decision. I would give them the space they demanded, but not in the way they imagined. The next morning, there would be no party, no reconciliation, only 99 missed calls that I would never answer. I have heard that at a certain age, birthdays begin to feel like audits. Not celebrations, but tallies of decisions, of debts, of what you gave the world and what it gave back. On the night of my 70th, I sat in my study and listened to the grandfather clock count the seconds like a careful accountant. The Charles River moved as it always does beyond the bay window, indifferent, steady, a ribbon of pewter under the winter moon. The house, the Montclair house, was as quiet as a cathedral after Mass. You can spend a lifetime filling rooms with meaning and still end up alone in them. I know this now. The message arrived between one tick and the next. My phone vibrated on the leather blotter, the same way it has vibrated for quarterly updates from my portfolio managers, for end-of-day summaries from the factory in Worcester, for 1,000 small alerts that add up to a life of structure. Structure is what I'm best at. Structure and steel. The companies I built take raw metal and make it obedient. Doors close because I tell them to. Bridges hold because I demand it. I have always trusted what can be measured. But I was not prepared for a measurement of love in 2 sentences. We need space. Please don't reach out to us anymore. There was no preface. No faltering apology, no attempt to soften the blow. It was an instruction, efficient, complete. In business, I admire brevity. In family, it sounded like a termination clause. Then I saw the heart beneath it, the tiny red seal of approval from my daughter-in-law, Genevieve. She had liked my dismissal. A small gesture, but it landed like a gavel. For a long moment, I simply looked at the screen and felt the way you feel when your doctor says the word you were sure belonged to someone else. I am not a man easily surprised. Life, if you live it with intention, loses its sharp corners. You learn to anticipate. Yet the sight of that heart, Genevieve's polite, curated cruelty, cut me open with a clean, surgical line. I let the phone dim. Darkness returned to the glass, and in it I could see the room reflected, shelves of leather spines, the desk I bought in Paris when Theo was 9, a portrait of my late wife, Alina, angled just so. It was Alina who taught me that abundance is a language and children learn it faster than verbs. I wanted Theo fluent. He was our only child, and grief after Alina's illness had left me with a compulsion to overcorrect. I filled Theo's childhood with everything I could afford and everything I wished I had been: given a townhouse on Commonwealth Avenue when he graduated, the lease on a hand-built motorcar when he said he wanted to feel independent, a black card with a limit that might as well have been the horizon. It was a father's penance, I suppose. You buy your son's comfort because you cannot buy back time. The first warning should have been the toast he made at 25. We were at a club on Beacon Hill that still refuses to admit new money unless it forgets to shower first. Theo raised his glass and thanked me for what he called the seed capital of his life. The room laughed. How clever, how modern. I smiled because fathers smile when they are outnumbered. But I remembered the phrase, and in the years that followed I watched how easily he and Genevieve treated my love like a renewable resource, one they could waste without consequence because surely the sun would rise again. In my business, waste demands correction. In my family, I delayed it for too long. I picked up the phone again, not to reply, but to scroll. Old messages unfurled, photos of vacations I had funded, lists of items I had purchased, transfers authorized with a thumbprint in the back of town cars and airport lounges. In none of them was there the gratitude that makes generosity feel like an exchange instead of an extraction. There were plenty of hearts, of course. Genevieve has always been liberal with hearts. Space, Theo wrote. In the language of logistics, space is measured, purchased, optimized. In the language of fathers, space is a wound. But I am fluent in both, and I am tired of only speaking one at home. If my son wanted distance, then I owed him the dignity of receiving exactly what he requested, precisely, cleanly, completely. I stood, the joints in my knees announcing their opinion, and walked to the wall safe behind the oil painting of the river regatta. The biometric scanner recognized my thumb with a small green approval that felt more human than the one Genevieve had tapped. Inside sat the Montclair Trust, binders, ledgers, original deeds, the skeletal blueprints of a dynasty built to outlast weather and whim. It was all there in tidy sections: real property, the Pied Terra on Madison, the seaside house on Nantucket, movables, cars leased through the holdings company, lines of credit and guarantees, allowances and automatic disbursements that stroked so gently you could forget the hand existed. I slid the main binder free. The paper had the heft of intention. Names, clauses, contingencies. I had drafted much of it with Edward Sinclair, a lawyer whose handwriting looks like a judge's conscience. We built the structure to protect, to simplify, to ensure Theo would never have to barter pieces of his dignity just to stand upright. I told myself it was love. Perhaps it was fear. The clock chimed 9. In Boston, restaurants were finishing their second seating. Somewhere across the river, Theo and Genevieve were likely laughing over dessert that did not fill them, surrounded by a world that exists for people who do not ask what things cost. I imagined the phone on their linen-draped table, how Theo might glance at it to see if I had written back. He expects pursuit. That is the problem with building a bridge for someone: they believe it will appear beneath them wherever they step. I returned to my chair and set the binder down. There is a moment before you pull a lever when you ask yourself whether the machine is calibrated for mercy. Mercy is cheap when you fear being alone. But the loneliest sound in my life has been the echo of my own concessions. I unlocked my phone, opened Theo's contact, and stared at the screen. There is no dignified way to block your child. The interface is the same whether you are deleting a telemarketer or the person who once reached for your finger with a newborn's fierce insistence. I pressed the option and confirmed. Then I did the same to Genevieve. For a second the study felt lighter, as if a pressure system had shifted out to sea. On my desk sat an old fountain pen with a hairline crack near the Capellina's wedding gift to me. I use it for signatures that must mean something. I removed the cap and set it beside the binder, then opened my calendar and placed a call for the morning. "Edward," I said when his assistant answered, "tell him I need him at 8. Not 9. There's work to be done." I ended the call and allowed myself to breathe. The night had begun as an audit. It would end as a decision. I poured 2 fingers of the scotch I keep for moments when I refuse to be softened, walked to the window, and watched a single skiff cut the river, its wake silver under the moon. Somewhere out there, a young man was rowing against a current he could feel. Theo has never truly felt one. He will. Back at the desk, the phone lay face down. It would stay that way. I would not chase. I would not explain. I would honor the request as written, space delivered with the precision of an engineer and the finality of a patriarch. In the morning there would be paperwork, and switches, and systems to unwind. There would be numbers to turn to 0 and doors to instruct not to open. For tonight, there was only the quiet, and the clock keeping time for a family that had run out of it. Morning light has a way of stripping things bare. The ornate curtains in my bedroom could not disguise the fact that I had woken to a world permanently altered. The night before, my son had told me to stay out of his life, and I had obliged him with a block list. But that was only the beginning. If Theo wanted distance, then I would show him the true geography of space. At 7 sharp, I was dressed, pressed, and on the road. Boston was still yawning awake as my driver steered the Bentley through streets slick with early frost. I did not bring my phone out of my pocket. I didn't need to. There would be no calls worth answering. We pulled into the granite circle of a building whose very stones whispered permanence, Sinclair and Harwood LLP, established 1894. My attorney, Edward Sinclair, has been my confidant and legal architect for 3 decades. He drafted the Montclair Trust with the precision of a surgeon and the foresight of a general. If I was going to pull the lever that would undo my son's entire illusion of independence, Edward was the man I wanted beside me. Edward's office was a cathedral of mahogany and glass. Shelves lined with law reports, a panoramic view of the Charles, and a single leather chair positioned opposite his desk. He rose when I entered. "Elias," he said with the warmth of someone who has already read the headlines of your soul. "You look resolved." "I am," I replied. "We need to make adjustments to the trust." He didn't blink. "I assumed this day might come." "What happened?" I gave him the short version. No trembling voice, no plea for sympathy, just the facts. My birthday. The text. The digital applause from Genevieve. A son who saw me not as a father but as an ATM with a surname. Edward listened, his hands steepled, his silver hair catching the morning light. When I finished, he simply nodded. "I've told you before, Elias, a revocable trust is not a prison. It's a fortress, and you hold the only key. Do you want to lock the gates?" I reached into my briefcase and laid the binder on his desk. "Not just lock them. Seal them. They asked for space. I intend to give it." Edward opened the file with the ease of a man who has spent his life navigating labyrinths of legalese. He flipped past the family tree, the asset inventory, the disbursement schedule. "As it stands," he said, "Theo and Genevieve are listed as sole beneficiaries. They control nothing, of course it all flows from you. The penthouse lease on Madison Avenue, the Nantucket property, the Range Rover, the Aston Martin, the American Express Black Card, the Platinum Visa, the monthly allowance at $25,000, yes. 25, I confirmed. And every cent was a mistake." Edward adjusted his glasses. "Then here's what we'll do. We'll draft an amendment today. Effective immediately, all credit lines terminated. All leases rescinded. The monthly allowance deleted. The trust will continue, but the beneficiaries can be changed." He paused deliberately, giving me the space to consider whether this was grief speaking or conviction. I answered without hesitation. "Remove them." His pen scratched across the paper with a quiet finality. "And reassign?" "Yes. To no Oni at least, not yet. I'll decide the new purpose soon." For a moment, silence settled between us, heavy but not uncomfortable. Edward finally said, "Elias, I was at Theo's 30th birthday party. I remember the toast he gave. He thanked you for the seed capital of his life. Not your love. Not your sacrifices. Just capital. That's when I knew he didn't see you as a father anymore. He saw you as a bank." The words landed like confirmation of something I had long suspected. A bank does not hug you. A bank does not teach you right from wrong. A bank simply dispenses. And when the balance runs out, customers look elsewhere. I leaned back in my chair and let the decision settle into my bones. It wasn't anger that filled me, nor even sadness. It was clarity. For decades, I had been underwriting Theo's life as though he were a company worth investing in. But companies that burn through capital without return go bankrupt. And I would no longer subsidize his arrogance. Edward closed the file. We'll notarize everything today. By this evening, their world will begin to flicker and fail. Declined cards. Frozen memberships. Calls that go unanswered. Good, I said. Let them feel it. He studied me with the calm patience of a man who has seen dynasties rise and fall. Do you want them to suffer, Elias? Or do you want them to learn? I considered the question carefully. Outside the window, the river gleamed, a current indifferent to sentiment. Both, I said at last. Suffering is the only teacher left to them. And if it brings knowledge, well, then it will be the first return on my investment. Edward gave the faintest smile, the kind you allow when justice aligns with the law. Very well. By tomorrow, the Montclairs they know themselves to be will cease to exist. And there is not a court in this country that can undo it. I rose, buttoned my coat, and extended my hand. Thank you, Edward. You've been more than my lawyer. You've been my compass. As I walked out of his office, the world outside felt sharper, clearer, as though the air itself respected the boundary I had drawn. Theo had asked for space. I was about to give him the entire universe of it. Tomorrow, when the waiter at Per Se handed back his declined black card, when the cleaning service failed to show, when Genevieve's luxury car was lifted onto a tow truck, they would realize the truth. The trust they had in me was not unconditional. It was revocable. And I had just revoked it. Theodore Montclair had always believed reality could be bent with a swipe of a card. That belief was about to meet its first immovable wall. I wasn't there when it happened, of course, but I know my son well enough to picture it in perfect detail. He and Genevieve had chosen Le Jardin, one of Manhattan's temples of excess, for their afternoon meal. It was the kind of place where you don't eat dinner so much as perform it. Waiters glide instead of walk. Portions arrive arranged like modern art, each drizzled stroke on the plate more costly than a week's groceries for an ordinary family. And Theo thrived in that environment, wearing entitlement like a bespoke suit. They had ordered extravagantly wine older than Theo himself, wagyu that had been flown across an ocean for their table alone, truffle shavings sprinkled like confetti on Genevieve's risotto. I could imagine the way she leaned in, taking photos from above, curating the perfect narrative for her online admirers, the Montclairs at leisure, taste refined, wealth eternal. Then came the bill. A leather folder, discreetly placed between them, the waiter's white glove lingering just long enough to acknowledge status. Theo reached for it, flashing the kind of easy smile that only exists when you've never paid for the consequences of anything in your life. He slid out his American Express black card, the heavy metal, he used to call it, as if titanium could buy credibility. The waiter bowed slightly and vanished. Conversation resumed, Genevieve scrolling through comments on her photos, Theo lecturing her on which ski resorts were worth their altitude. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned. His face was as smooth as marble, but his voice carried the faint crack of apology. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Montclair," he said, lowering his eyes just enough. "Your card has been declined." The word declined doesn't exist in Theo's vocabulary. His laugh was immediate, sharp, dismissive. "Declined? Impossible. Run it again." He said it not as a request but as an order, the way a king might wave away a servant who dared suggest rain was wet. The waiter inclined his head, retreated once more. Genevieve frowned, annoyed less at the problem and more at the interruption of their perfect afternoon. "It's clearly the machine," she muttered, tapping her manicured nails on the table. "These things happen. But they don't not in Theo's world. Not until now." The waiter returned again, this time without the protective armor of a smile. "I regret to inform you, sir. The charge cannot be processed." The edges of Theo's composure began to fray. He reached into his wallet with the theatrical impatience of a man insulted by reality. Out came a platinum visa, the one he liked to wave around at parties. Here. This one has no limit. Except now it did. A third trip. A third refusal. By now, Genevieve's face had paled under her careful makeup. She shot daggers at Theo, whispering, "What is going on?" Her voice was low but sharp enough to cut glass. Theo's jaw tightened. He was no longer laughing. He offered her a quick glare before pulling out his phone. "It's a screw-up at the bank," he insisted, more to himself than to her. His thumb hovered over my name, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion when the call went straight to voicemail. He tried again. And again. Each attempt bounced into silence. Genevieve, desperate, offered her own sapphire reserve card, thrusting it at the waiter like a sword meant to reclaim honor. Declined. The table had transformed from a stage of affluence into an island of embarrassment. The hush around them wasn't reverence, Anna Marie, it was observation. Diners glanced sidelong, waiters exchanged coded looks. Even in rarefied circles, humiliation carries a scent, and the Montclairs were drowning in it. I can picture the panic in Theo's eyes, the frantic rationalizations colliding with the dawning terror that something larger than a technical issue was unfolding. He would have leaned across to Genevieve, his voice lowered to a hiss, "The allowance. It's supposed to hit yesterday. 25,000. It's automatic." She would have grabbed his wrist, nails digging in. "Then check it. Now." And so he did. He opened his banking app under the sterile light of the restaurant, expecting reassurance. What he found instead was an empty account staring back like a freshly dug grave. "It's not there," he whispered, though whispers carry far in rooms built for gossip. The weight of those 3 words was heavier than any balance he had ever ignored. I imagined the silence that followed. The waiter standing patiently, the unpaid bill still nestled in its folder. Genevieve's fury simmering behind her lips, Theo's face blanching as if the ground beneath him had opened. For the first time in his adult life, he encountered a locked door with no key, no loophole, no father to lean on. By the time they stumbled out of Le Jardin, the facade had cracked. Their world of unlimited access had ended with a single meal they couldn't afford. Back in Boston, I sat in my study, sipping black coffee as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The first domino had fallen, and I knew exactly how the rest would follow. This wasn't vengeance. It was arithmetic. The first decline at Le Jardin was a spectacle. The next wave of consequences arrived more quietly, but no less devastating. They came in the form of absence, the sudden evaporation of conveniences that had long been invisible to Theo and Genevieve, because invisible things are the ones you never imagined could vanish. I can see it now, Genevieve waking up late on a Tuesday morning in their Madison Avenue penthouse. Sunlight streaming through sheer curtains, her silk robe tied loosely as she waited for the familiar buzz at the door. Every week, at exactly 10, the cleaning service arrived with their quiet efficiency. The women knew the house better than she did, scrubbing surfaces she'd never touched, folding linens she didn't know how to wash. But that morning, the doorbell never rang. At first, she thought perhaps they were running late. Then her phone buzzed with a notification. A bland, polite message from the agency. "Dear Mrs. Montclair, your service has been suspended due to non-payment. Please remit balance to resume." Her gasp would have echoed through the apartment. Suspended. A word she associated with other people's failures, not her own. Meanwhile, Theo was striding through the glass doors of his exclusive gym, tossing his duffel onto the counter. His membership card beeped against the scanner. Denied. Again. The receptionist's practiced smile faltered. "I'm sorry, Mr. Montclair," she murmured, lowering her voice. "Your membership has been frozen." Frozen. He had never even considered the possibility. To Theo, gyms were not places you earned entry, taught they were environments that bent to his arrival. Now, a $20 an hour employee with a clipboard held more power than he did. Then came the smaller humiliations, each one gnawing at the edges of their curated life. The luxury meal kit's organic salmon fillets portioned into neat trays stopped appearing at their doorstep. Their wine of the month subscription sent a final reminder, your account is past due. Streaming services blinked out on their television one by one. Even their dog walker sent a curt message, no payment, no service. For the first time, the Montclairs had to enter a grocery store. I imagine Genevieve pushing a cart with brittle discomfort, her designer heels clacking against linoleum floors. People recognized her from social media, and the sight of her staring blankly at price tags must have felt like spotting a duchess lost in a subway station. At home, the silence grew sharp. Without cleaners, without deliveries, without the hum of endless convenience, the apartment felt strangely alive with tasks undone. Dust collected. Laundry piled. Meals burned. Genevieve snapped at Theo over trivialities, why he hadn't fixed the dishwasher, why the bills weren't paid, why he couldn't just call your father and fix this mess. But Theo knew better. He had tried. His calls fell into silence, his messages bounced back with the cruel efficiency of a blocked number. To him, it felt less like being ignored and more like being erased. The arguments escalated. Genevieve's voice, once dripping with charm, sharpened to a blade. Do you realize how humiliating this is? I had to cancel brunch because I couldn't pay the driver. My followers think I'm in Paris this week. I'm hiding in our own apartment. Theo fired back, his face red, his voice cracking under the weight of something he'd never known before, helplessness. What do you want me to do, Genevieve? He's cut us off. It's done. Her eyes narrowed. Then fix it. You're Theodore Montclair. But titles mean nothing when the signatures that back them are gone. In Boston, I read reports Edward sent me, matter-of-fact updates about suspended accounts and cancelled leases. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply acknowledged each one like a farmer checking off rows in a field. The harvest had begun, and every consequence was the fruit of seeds I myself had planted years ago. What Theo and Genevieve didn't yet understand was that money isn't just papered scaffolding. It holds up the world you think you built yourself. Take away the scaffolding, and the walls collapse under their own weight. For the Montclairs, the collapse had begun in whispers, no cleaners, no gyms, no subscriptions. Soon it would roar with eviction notices and tow trucks. But for now, they were still clinging to scraps of dignity, quarreling in the half-light of an apartment that suddenly felt too large, too empty, and far too real. Entitlement dies hardest when it is dragged into the light. Behind closed doors, Theo and Genevieve could bicker and rationalize, still pretending the chaos was temporary, that a glitch in the system would eventually reset itself. But humiliation in public has no refuge. It exposes weakness not only to yourself but to every set of watching eyes. It began with the letter on the door. Their Madison Avenue penthouse had always been a fortress of glass and steel, perched high above the city like a throne. Genevieve loved to photograph herself on the balcony with the skyline behind her, captioning posts with phrases like, "Grateful for this view," as though gratitude were something you performed, not felt. On a Wednesday afternoon, Theo returned from a futile attempt to sort matters at the bank and found a stark notice taped across the polished mahogany door. The letters were impossible to miss. Notice to vacate non-payment of rent. Rent. The word itself was poison. Theo's first instinct was denial. This must be some mistake, some bureaucratic mix-up. He tore the notice down, crumpling it in his fist, his face flushed with rage. Genevieve appeared behind him, phone in hand, frozen. "Rent?" she hissed. "What do you mean, rent? Your father bought this place." Theo's voice faltered. I thought he did. It's in the trust. He always handled it." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. For the first time, Genevieve looked at her husband not as a provider of privilege but as a boy lost in a game he didn't understand. The building's doorman, who had always greeted them with rehearsed warmth, now avoided their eyes. Neighbors passed in the hallway, their glances sharp with curiosity. The Montclairs were no longer the untouchable couple in the corner unit. They were tenants behind on rent. And that truth was now taped, in black and red, for the entire building to witness. But fate has a way of choreographing collapses with brutal precision. That very evening, Genevieve stormed out, her cheeks blotched from tears of fury. She needed space, she told Theo. She needed air. More truthfully, she needed to be seen by friends, by followers, by anyone who could remind her she was still Genevieve Montclair, not a humiliated woman facing eviction. She descended the marble steps, heels clicking, and strode toward her white Range Rover, the car she had once showcased on social media as my rolling sanctuary. It was parked, as always, in its reserved spot. Except this time, it wasn't waiting for her. Instead, a tow truck idled, its amber lights flashing with mechanical indifference. The SUV's front wheels were already lifted off the pavement. A man in a jumpsuit stood with a clipboard, chewing gum, as if the Montclairs were just another Tuesday job. Genevieve's scream cut through the evening air. "What are you doing?" "That's my car." The tow operator barely looked up. "Ma'am, this vehicle is leased under the Montclair Family Trust. Accounts delinquent. We've got orders." "You can't do this," she snapped, her voice shrill enough to draw attention from passers-by. A couple paused on the sidewalk, whispering. A neighbor peered from a window above. Even the doorman stood awkwardly, torn between decorum and curiosity. The operator shrugged. He had paperwork, signatures, authority that outstripped Genevieve's indignation. "You'll have to take it up with the leaseholder. I'm just here to do my job." Her fury turned to desperation. She clutched at the driver's arm, her carefully curated poise dissolving into raw panic. "Do you know who I am? Do you know who my husband is?" The man gave her a flat look. "Ma'am, I don't care if you're the Queen of England. Payments overdue. Trucks rolling out." The Range Rover lurched forward, lifted fully now, chains rattling like a death knell. Genevieve's protests turned to sobs, her mascara streaking down her face. Around her, the city watched. Strangers recorded on their phones. Within hours, the scene would no doubt circulate online, the glamorous Mrs. Montclair reduced to begging on the street as her luxury car was repossessed. Upstairs, Theo heard the commotion and rushed down, only to arrive as the tow truck pulled away. The sight of his wife crumpled on the curb, her designer heels scraping against the pavement, was a punch he hadn't prepared for. He tried to help her up, but she shoved him away, her voice breaking. "This is your fault. You said everything was ours. You lied." Theo had no defense. His face was pale, his words stuttering. "It was ours. It always was until he..." But he couldn't finish. Because the truth was, it had never been theirs. It had always been mine. Back in Boston, I was in my garden, trimming a row of boxwoods, when my security app pinged with an update from Edward's office: penthouse lease terminated. Vehicle repossessed. I placed the phone back in my pocket without a word. My shears clicked rhythmically, each cut clean and deliberate. For Theo and Genevieve, the illusion was gone. In less than a week, their kingdom had collapsed from velvet to rubble. Public humiliation has a unique sting. It strips not only wealth but also dignity, exposing entitlement for what it truly is, dependency dressed in silk. And humiliation is not easily forgotten. They thought they had tasted loss at the restaurant. They thought the absence of cleaning staff, of trainers, of deliveries was suffering. But real suffering is when the world watches your crown slip, and no one reaches to fix it. And this was only the beginning. For all their lives together, Theo and Genevieve had believed my silence meant surrender. If I did not argue, if I did not correct, if I did not refuse, then surely it meant consent. They mistook patience for weakness. But when the penthouse eviction notice and the repossession of the Range Rover fell on the same day, the last traces of their pride cracked wide open. That night, in their barren apartment, desperation replaced dignity. Their conversations no longer had the cadence of a quarrel, they were frantic exchanges between drowning swimmers, each pulling the other under. Finally, Theo slammed his hand on the counter, his voice hoarse. Enough. We're going to him. He can't ignore us if we're standing on his lawn. Genevieve's eyes were wild, her mascara smudged from tears she hadn't bothered to wipe. And what? Beg at his feet? Is that what we've become? Theo's reply was stripped of all arrogance. If it gets us back in, yes. The drive from Manhattan to Boston was under 2 hours, but I imagine it felt like a lifetime to them. Every passing mile carried not hope but dread. The Bentley was gone, they rattled northward in Theo's aging sedan, the leather cracked, the air thick with the stench of their unraveling empire. Meanwhile, I was in my garden at Montclair Manor. The estate has stood for 4 generations, perched above the Charles River, its stone walls and wrought iron gates a reminder that legacy is not ornamental, it is fortified. That afternoon, I wore my gardening gloves and noise-canceling headphones, pruning the rose beds that Alina once adored. A cello suite by Bach filled my ears, each note deliberate, ordered, eternal. The world beyond my walls did not exist. The first alert came to my watch, vehicle approaching main gate. My system is discreet, never obtrusive. I did not need to check the camera feed. I knew who it was. The timing was inevitable. I did not move. I inspected a rose stem, looking for blight. The shears clicked, steel on steel, clean and sharp. At the front gate, Theo's sedan rolled to a stop. He leapt out before the engine cut, slamming the door behind him. His suit, once tailored to perfection, now sagged on a frame thinned by sleepless nights and hollow meals. He pressed the intercom button again and again, his voice cutting through the speaker, sharp and demanding. "Dad! Open the gate. Enough of this. We need to talk." Beside him, Genevieve paced like a caged animal, her heels sinking into the gravel drive. She alternated between pleading gestures and clenched fists, her voice shrill with panic. "Elias! You can't do this. We're family." But the gate remained closed. The intercom stayed silent. The system was designed to ignore noise until it became trespass. Frustration mounted. Theo's hand slammed the button so many times the system flagged the activity, sending another alert to my watch. Still, I did not move. I bent to pluck a weed from the soil, my gloves brushing earth that smelled of life, not desperation. Unable to break the silence, they began circling the perimeter, walking the length of the 10-foot stone wall as though a hidden entrance might magically appear. They looked like exiles begging for re-entry to a kingdom that had forgotten them. Eventually, they reached a stretch of iron fencing that allowed a clear view into the back gardens. And there they saw me. I felt their gaze before I turned. The weight of it pressed against my back, a desperate insistence that I acknowledge them. But I did not. I chose a deep crimson rose, Mr. Lincoln, and inspected its leaves with slow precision. My shears caught the sunlight as I clipped a perfect bloom. Behind me, muffled by Bach, I could see Theo shouting, his face crimson with rage. Genevieve's hands flailed, one moment begging, the next clawing at the bars. To them, this was a grand confrontation, a chance to perform contrition or anger, whichever would pry the gates open. To me, it was nothing more than a faint buzzing, insects against the fortress walls. Minutes passed. Their voices grew ragged. Their movements slowed, exhaustion etching lines across their faces. And then the sleek black sedan of the security patrol rolled silently up the road. Marcus stepped out, the same guard who has patrolled Montclair Manor for years. His uniform was immaculate, his presence calm, steady, immovable. He approached with the patience of a man who has seen every kind of desperation before. I could not hear their exchange, but I could read the body language from where I stood. Theo's defiance collapsed into empty gestures, Genevieve's drama dissolved into tearful appeals. Marcus listened, nodded once, and then pointed to the road. His meaning was clear: leave. They were no longer Montclairs of the manor. They were trespassers at the gate. At last, they slumped back into their car. The engine coughed to life, the headlight swung away, and the sedan crawled down the lane. Marcus waited until they disappeared, then returned to his vehicle and departed in silence. Only then did I remove my headphones. The cello gave way to the real music of my garden, the rustle of leaves, the call of a finch, the whisper of the river. I held the freshly cut rose in my hand, inhaling its fragrance. That was the true confrontation, not their shouting, not their demands. It was this, my peace against their chaos, my silence against their noise. They came seeking leverage, but they left with nothing. They had thought they could breach the gates with anger, guilt, or shame. But the gates of Montclair Manor do not yield to noise. They yield only to respect. And respect, for them, was a language long forgotten. Their drive back to Manhattan would be the longest silence of their lives. The decision to summon Theo and Genevieve wasn't made out of cruelty. It was made out of clarity. For weeks, they had battered against silence with calls, texts, even trespass at the gates of Montclair Manor. They had asked for space, and I had given it immeasurable, unbridgeable space. But eventually, silence must become language. And so I instructed Edward Sinclair to extend an invitation. Not from me, but from his office. Neutral, clinical, impossible to ignore, meeting regarding the Montclair family trust. Attendance required. To Theo and Genevieve, it must have read like a lifeline. The morning of the meeting, I arrived at Sinclair and Harwood early. Edward's office occupies the top floor of a granite tower overlooking Boston Harbor. The lobby is all marble and brass, the kind of place that reminds visitors wealth is not merely owned but administered, archived, safeguarded. We met in his private study first, a quiet room paneled in dark oak, with shelves that smelled of law and time. The amended document lay on the desk between us, the amended and restated Montclair Family Revocable Trust. Its leather cover gleamed under the light, the gold lettering embossed like a verdict. Edward glanced at me over the rim of his glasses. No hesitation, Elias. This is irrevocable once we sign and notarize. I placed my palm on the document. Hesitation is for men unsure of their duty. My duty is clear. He nodded once, then gestured toward the conference room. The room was designed to overwhelm, a long slab of mahogany polished to a mirror finish, one wall entirely glass with a commanding view of the harbor. Deals worth hundreds of millions had been sealed at that table. Divorces had been carved into stone. Today, it would host a different kind of separation, the surgical cutting away of entitlement. I took my seat at the head of the table. Edward sat to my right, his expression unreadable, the trust binder resting before me like a weapon cloaked in leather. We waited. At precisely 10 o'clock, the door opened. Edward's assistant ushered in Theo and Genevieve. For a moment, I barely recognized them. Theo's tailored suit hung awkwardly, his shoulders stooped as though bearing a weight he had never trained for. Shadows pooled under his eyes. Genevieve's makeup was immaculate, but no cosmetics could disguise the tension at the corners of her mouth, the brittle edge in her posture. They were diminished, still clinging to the performance of grace, but stripped of the stage on which to act. "Father," Theo said, his voice rehearsed, almost steady. He sat down opposite me, Genevieve sliding into the chair beside him. The expanse of mahogany between us felt like a chasm. Edward opened the meeting with formality. "Thank you for coming. This is a discussion regarding the Montclair Family Trust, at the request of Mr. Montclair." That was Theo's cue. He leaned forward, clasping his hands in mock sincerity. "Dad," he began, "first of all, we're sorry. Truly. The last month has been unbearable. But it's given us perspective. We realize things got out of hand. That text message what I sent it was said in a moment of frustration. We never meant to hurt you. Genevieve reached across the table, as if to touch my hand, her eyes shimmering with carefully summoned tears. We love you, Elias. You're our family. That's all that matters. I did not move. My face was stone. I let their words spill across the table, hollow apologies dressed in velvet. They weren't apologizing for what they had done, they were apologizing for what they had lost. Theo's voice quickened, anxious to fill the silence. We'll do better. We'll handle things differently from now on. We've learned. Just please, Dad. We can't do this without you. When at last his words withered into silence, the room grew heavy. They looked at me with expectation, waiting for a familiar pattern: the negotiation, the conditional forgiveness, the reinstatement. That had been our rhythm for decades. But not today. I placed both hands on the leather binder before me and slid it across the polished wood toward them. The sound of it traveling across the table was the only noise in the room. It came to rest directly before Theo. Thank you for sharing, Theo, I said, my voice level, cold in its calmness. Now, I'd like you to look at this. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the cover. Genevieve leaned in, their heads nearly touching as they scanned the dense legal pages. They weren't reading for comprehension, they were hunting for reassurance, for familiar clauses about allowances, vehicles, credit lines. Their fingers flipped pages frantically, until I spoke again. Page 12, I said. Section 3. Primary beneficiaries. Theo's finger landed on the section. His breath caught. Genevieve's eyes darted across the lines, her lips silently mouthing the words. As you can see, I continued, my tone as precise as a surgeon's scalpel, Clause 3.1, which previously named Theodore and Genevieve Montclair as the sole beneficiaries, has been legally and irrevocably removed. Effective immediately. Genevieve made a strangled sound in her throat. Theo's knuckles whitened around the page, as if squeezing hard enough could make the ink rearrange itself. And furthermore, I went on, Clause 3.2, which detailed the monthly allowance, all credit lines, all leases has been deleted. Permanently. The silence in the room thickened. Even the hum of the city beyond the glass seemed to fall away. Finally, Genevieve raised her eyes to me, her face pale, her voice trembling with the last gasp of entitlement. So where does the money go? I let the question hang, savoring its irony. Then, slowly, I turned a page in my own copy of the trust. An excellent question. Page 15. Clause 4.1. They scrambled to follow, their eyes desperate. The entirety of the Montclair Trust $40 million will now be transferred to establish the Montclair Scholars Endowment. A perpetual scholarship fund, providing full tuition, housing, and support for low-income students pursuing engineering and architecture at MIT. Edward added the weight of finality, it is fully funded, irrevocable, and operational beginning this year. I leaned forward, locking eyes with my son. That's the school you dropped out of, Theo. After I paid for 2 full years. I thought it was time someone actually graduated with a Montclair investment. The color drained from his face. It wasn't just the money that had vanished, it was his failure, immortalized, turned into opportunity for strangers. His squandered privilege would now fuel the futures of those who would not waste it. Genevieve buried her face in her hands, sobbing. Theo stared down at the document, hollow, erased. For decades, they had lived on scaffolding I built. Today, I tore it down in front of them. And I did it with nothing more than paper, ink, and resolve. The meeting was over. The conference room dissolved behind me like a stage after the curtain falls. For Theo and Genevieve, that mahogany table had been an execution block. For me, it was a rebirth. By the time Edward and I left the tower, the Montclair Trust was no longer a gilded leash binding me to entitlement. It was a living endowment, a future untethered from the selfish demands of my son and his wife. Months passed. The quiet I once feared became my ally. I no longer measured my days by allowances transferred or voicemails unanswered. Instead, I measured them by the steady progress of roses in my garden, the smooth plane of wood in my workshop, the peace of evenings by the fire. Silence had stopped being absence, sight had become sanctuary. But silence does not remain still. It grows. 6 months later, I stood at a podium beneath the vaulted ceiling of an MIT auditorium. The inaugural ceremony of the Montclair Scholars' Endowment had filled the room with young faces, eager, nervous, alight with ambition. These students were not dressed in tailored suits or $1,000 dresses. They wore hope like a garment, stitched from hours of labor and dreams that had survived scarcity. I told them my story, not of wealth, but of beginning. Of building a business from a single workshop, of mistakes, of the dignity in sweat and failure. I spoke of how privilege without responsibility becomes rot, and how responsibility, even when heavy, builds character strong enough to carry futures. A legacy, I said, my voice carrying to the back row, is not what you leave for people. It's what you leave in them. My family name will live not in penthouses or luxury cars, but in every degree you earn, every invention you design, every life you change. You are the Montclair legacy now. Applause rose, not polite but thunderous. I felt lighter than I had in decades. Meanwhile, across the city, Theo and Genevieve's world had shrunk to reality. The penthouse had been replaced by a cramped 2-bedroom above a laundromat in Cambridge. The Range Rover was gone, replaced by Theo's old sedan with a failing transmission. Theo, once a man who tossed credit cards like confetti, now wore a neon vest at a logistics firm. I imagined him standing at a loading dock, clipboard in hand, learning the discipline of clock in, clock out, and the weight of work that left his body sore at night. There was bitterness in his eyes, no doubt, but also something new: responsibility. Genevieve managed a boutique clothing shop in a suburban mall. No more curated brunches or filtered selfies in Parisian cafes. Now, she folded sweaters for a paycheck, her charm traded for strained smiles at impatient customers. Her following on social media withered, starved of luxury to display. For the first time, she wasn't admired, she was ignored. And in that anonymity, she began to understand what real work tasted like. Their marriage? Fragile, perhaps, but grounded in survival. No longer a kingdom of glass, but a shack rebuilt with their own hands. Back at MIT, after the ceremony, I stepped off the stage into a crowd of students thanking me, shaking my hand, promising to prove themselves worthy of the chance I had given. In their eyes, I saw the gratitude I had once longed for in my own sons. Gratitude not for money, but for belief. That night, I returned to Montclair Manor. The sun dipped low, painting the Charles River in gold. I sat in my garden, the roses nodding in the breeze, and felt a quiet contentment. The silence around me was no longer heavy, it was alive with possibility. Then, my phone buzzed. For 6 months, it had been still, untroubled by desperate calls and demands. I picked it up. The message was from an unfamiliar number. Just one word. Dad? I stared at the screen, the 2 letters and a question mark glowing in the twilight. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't an accusation. It was a quest. I own a fragile bridge stretched across a canyon carved by their own choices. I set the phone back on the table, screen down. For the first time in years, the decision of whether to answer was entirely mine. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the crickets sing, the river murmur, the roses sway. The silence wasn't absence anymore. It was a beginning.